Greetings from the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion on Supreme Court Justice Louis D. Brandeis and social justice. Our partners for today's program are the Capitol Jewish Museum and the Supreme Court Historical Society, and we thank them for their support. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs you can view on our YouTube channel. On Thursday, November 19th at noon, author Barnes Carr will discuss his recent book, The Lennon Plot, The Untold Story of America's Midnight War Against Russia. And on Tuesday, November 24th at 7 p.m., Denise Kiernan will discuss her latest book, We Gather Together, which tells the story of Sarah Josepha Hale, who in the 19th century campaigned to establish an annual day of Thanksgiving. Today, we will look at the life and career of the first Jewish justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Louis Brandeis, who served on the court from 1916 until 1939. His successor on the bench, William O. Douglas, called Brandeis a militant crusader for social justice. Brandeis carried that passion through his 23 years on the court and became one of the nation's most influential jurists, as documented in the many Supreme Court case files and opinions preserved here at the National Archives. Now let's meet our speakers. Professor Brad Snyder teaches constitutional law, sports law, and constitutional history at Georgetown Law. He is the author of 3 books and has published several law review articles. A graduate of Duke University and Yale Law School, he clerked for the Honorable Dorothy W. Nelson on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Jennifer Lowe is the Supreme Court Historical Society's Director of Programs and Strategic Planning. She served previously as the Society's Director of Publications and Managing Editor of the Journal of Supreme Court History. She is the author of Harold Burton and Samuel Alito in the Supreme Court Illustrated Biographies, 1789 to 2011. Please welcome Brad Snyder and Jennifer Lowe.
Hi, my name is Brad Snyder. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be with my colleague and friend Jennifer Lowe on YouTube today to discuss the life and career of Justice Louis Brandeis. We're going to sort of do a deep dive into Justice Brandeis's confirmation hearings and then talk about sort of an unexplored angle of his career as a sort of crusader for social justice. Before I do, though, I really want to thank a couple of people. First, I want to thank my friend Jennifer for being my interlocutor today. I've known her for a long time, and we have a lot of fun talking about Supreme Court history together. Secondly, I want to thank Susan Clifton of the National Archives, Rebecca Sobel, Stephanie Fry, and Kara Blond of the Jewish Museum of Washington, D.C. And then we have a couple of really special guests in the audience. We have several of Louis Brandeis's family members, including his grandsons, 2 of his grandsons, Frank Gilbert and his wife Anne, and his grandson Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a former member of the University of Wisconsin law faculty, and members of his family. Lastly, but not least, I'm standing on the shoulders talking about Louis Brandeis of several scholarly giants. Melvin Urofsky, Louis Paper, and Philippa Strum have all written just absolutely fantastic biographies of Brandeis, and I think Professor Strum is with us today on YouTube, and I'm delighted to have her there, and I just wanted to thank all of them before we start because I've greatly profited from all their work.
Thank you, Brad, and I'm really delighted to be here too. So members of the audience, you can submit questions via the YouTube chat, and we will leave time at the end for questions. So Brad, let's start with the nomination. On January 28th, 1916, President Wilson nominates Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Did he wake up that morning and decide on this? What was laying the groundwork for this?
Well, if you could show that first slide of Woodrow Wilson, I'd really appreciate it. Woodrow Wilson and Brandeis go way back, Jennifer. During the 1912 presidential campaign, which was a really hard-fought 3-way race between Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt running an insurgent sort of candidacy to try to retake the White House, and then the incumbent William Howard Taft, Brandeis shocked a lot of his progressive friends at the political salon known as the House of Truth by backing Wilson. And he, during that 1912 campaign, became sort of an advisor and speechwriter for Wilson on one of the biggest issues of the day, which was about antitrust and which was about how to control illegal monopolies. So that during that campaign, Brandeis and Wilson really sort of bonded and gained each other's trust. And Wilson wanted to reward him. So Wilson thought highly enough of Brandeis to want to make him his attorney general. And if he couldn't make him his attorney general, he wanted to make him the Secretary of Commerce and Labor. Unfortunately, Wilson's chief advisor on the cabinet was Colonel Edward House, who happened to be a raging anti-Semite. And House managed to block Brandeis for both attorney general and for Secretary of Commerce and Labor. Now, the funny thing about the Supreme Court opening is that Wilson decided to submit Brandeis's name to the Senate when Colonel House happened to be out of the country, right? So House didn't have the opportunity to talk him out of it. But let me tell you, Brandeis's nomination came as a complete shock. And if you could show the second slide for me, which is a wonderful cartoon by Puck, a reporter who was in the well of the Senate when that nomination was announced said the Senate simply gasped when Brandeis's name was announced as the next Supreme Court nominee. And this is a wonderful cartoon that is a little hard to read, but shows all of the sort of people who are really worried about Brandeis: Wall Street, privilege, big business really fears Brandeis, who was really a crusader against monopolies and who really believed in what he described as the curse of bigness. That basically that any monopoly that was too big was harming the economy and preventing smaller businesses from really gaining traction, and were really just hurting the whole economic system. And there was an unlevel playing field between big business and small business, and between business and organized labor.
Okay, so we know who opposes him. Who was in his corner, though? And what was the House of Truth?
It was more than big business, Jennifer. Like President Taft, or ex-President Taft, I could say, he was absolutely livid, right? Taft was beside himself. I don't know how much you know about President Taft. I'm sure you know a ton. But William Howard Taft's dream was really to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And one of the criticisms of him as president was he was sort of biding his time so he could be the Chief Justice. And the idea of Louis Brandeis on the Supreme Court was really just anathema to him. And they had tangled. And when Taft was president, there was a scandal called the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Super complicated, but basically what happened was Gifford Pinchot was a whistleblower and called out the U.S. government for leasing coal-rich Alaska lands on like a sweetheart deal. And Taft fired him. Well, Brandeis represented Pinchot and a guy named Louis Glavis, and he revealed in this lawsuit that Taft had actually relied on a backdated memo to fire Pinchot. So he basically fired him before all the evidence was in. And so they became sort of sworn enemies. Well, Taft by this time had been one of the joined six other ex-ABA presidents to oppose Brandeis's nomination. And this is what Taft said to journalist Gus Carger, who was sort of his confidant, and sort of Boswell. He called, this is Taft speaking, he called Brandeis a muckraker, an emotionalist for his own purposes, a socialist, a hypocrite, utterly unscrupulous, and a man of infinite cunning. Well, not only had Brandeis made an enemy of Taft, he had also made an enemy of the respectable people of Boston, the people who were sort of referred to as Old Boston, and Taft even referred to this too. He said that the people of Boston regard Brandeis as the most exalted type of dishonest trickster. Well, those Bostonians, they really went after him. So the two United States senators from Massachusetts, John W. Weeks, and Henry Cabot Lodge, they came out publicly and said Brandeis, and this is a direct quote, was temperamentally unfit to be on the Supreme Court. But the real opposition to Brandeis, if that's not enough, there's more, trust me. The real leader of the opposition to Brandeis coming out of Boston was the president of Harvard University, A. Lawrence Lowell. And Lowell organized a petition of 51 Bostonians who opposed Brandeis's nomination. And for those of you who know anything about Lowell, he's famous for 7 years after Brandeis's nomination for trying to establish a 15% quota on Jewish undergraduates at Harvard College. So that sort of shows you where Lowell's coming from on here. But he had a lot of enemies, and he needed defenders.
So who defended him?
Well, the people who defended him, not surprisingly, are the people from the progressive political salon and subject of my book, the House of Truth. The House of Truth is still standing. If you could go to the next slide for me. This should be a photo of the House of Truth. This was a house owned by Taft's Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Robert Valentine. And he invited other people in the Taft administration to live there who basically thought Taft was a horrible president and whose mission in life was to return Theodore Roosevelt back to the White House and unseat Taft. They thought Taft was a truly progressive voice on organized labor and on antitrust issues, and if only Theodore Roosevelt could return to power, could we level the playing field between business and labor and small business and big business. One of the most famous people who were among the house's original residents turned out to be a protege of Brandeis's, future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. And it was Frankfurter who really became sort of the leader, along with some of his friends, at a new magazine called The New Republic that took the lead on really defending Brandeis and really attacking the people who were attacking Brandeis's nomination.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the New Republic and Herb Crowley?
The New Republic was started by this really sort of dour, quiet guy named Herbert Crowley. And Crowley spent sort of 20 years working for an architectural magazine and failing to get his degree in philosophy at Harvard College until he wrote this book in 1909 called The Promise of an American Life. And that book profoundly influenced Theodore Roosevelt and coined the phrase New Nationalism, which became sort of the slogan for TR's 1912 presidential campaign. And the idea behind it simply was using the robust power of the federal government to make people's lives better, and particularly to level the playing field between labor and management and between big business and small business, and using the power of the presidency and Congress. Well, Crowley was on the opposite side of Brandeis, obviously, during the 1912 election, where Brandeis is writing speeches for Wilson, Crowley's writing speeches for TR, right? And they kind of hated each other. And Crowley really resented Harper's Weekly, which was run by Norman Hapgood, as sort of this pro-Wilson outlet. And what Crowley wanted was a magazine that was sort of a pro-TR progressive magazine. And so he starts the New Republic, backed by money from some bankers, Willard Straight and his wife, Dorothy, who's an heiress as well. But Willard Straight's a J.P. Morgan banker. He has lots of money. His wife has lots of money. They pour lots of money into starting this magazine, The New Republic. And Crowley comes down to Washington to live, to recruit editors. And one of the editors he tries to recruit, he's living right near the House of Truth. He's regularly dining with the people at the House of Truth, is Felix Frankfurter. Another young editor who he succeeds in recruiting is Walter Lippmann, who's 23 years old, a socialist, has spent most of his young career writing for socialist magazines. But Littman becomes one of the founding editors of the New Republic, and Frankfurter becomes a contributor. And what they realize early on, Frankfurter and Walter Lippmann, is that they need to team up and lead the fight for Brandeis because no one else is doing it. Harper's Weekly goes to press too late to do it and eventually goes out of business and so is unable to do it. And so really it's the New Republic leading the fight for Brandeis. And the great thing is that Frankfurter knew the opposition quite well, and he knew what was coming.
So there were hints that the opposition was coming earlier, particularly from the Washington establishment. So can you talk about the Cosmos Club?
Yeah, sure. So in 1915, a D.C. judge named William Hitz proposes Brandeis for non-resident membership at the Cosmos Club. And you might ask yourself, well, why does someone want to be a non-resident member of the Cosmos Club? Well, Brandeis frequently had business in Washington, and the great thing about the Cosmos Club was that you could stay at the Cosmos Club, like a hotel. So there was a practical reason for Brandeis wanting to be a member of the Cosmos Club, so he could stay there when he was in D.C. on business. And oh, by the way, the Cosmos Club was right down the street from the House of Truth, which was at S Street and 19th. You know, it's just across Connecticut Avenue. So it's not that far from his friends. But Hitz wrote Frankfurter on January 19th, 1915, and said Brandeis's Cosmos membership is in trouble, that businessmen who belong to the club, who did not like all of Brandeis's objections to mergers and to monopolies, were blocking his membership. So Frankfurter took it upon himself to write the Cosmos Club a letter. And I just want to briefly read from this letter, because I think these two paragraphs show you that Frankfurter knew that Brandeis was not only a social reformer and one of the best legal minds in the country, but he had also ticked off a lot of people. So this is what Frankfurter had to say. He said, as only 2 or 3 men in this country, he has affected the thoughts of the nation. He has profoundly affected our national ideals. He has been a leader who has influenced other leaders, and his power has thus penetrated far beyond the reach of his own personality. Mr. Brandeis has been an inventor of ideas propelled by a great moral force. But wait for this next paragraph. He says, Frankfurter says to the Cosmos Club, I am quite aware that in the process he has offended and alienated good men and true. That is quite inevitable in the case of a man who feels as passionately, who sees stupidity and wrong as profoundly, and believes as uncompromisingly as does Mr. Brandeis. The real question of moment surely is not this or that detached bit of minutiae in his life work. A judgment on such a basis involves such powers of complete calm and Martian detachment as no contemporary, certainly no contemporary who is ignorant of or disagrees with his social and political aims, is capable of. The real question is the significance of his life as an entirety, the devotion, the ability, the generosity to which he puts his great powers to ends that seem to him vital to the spiritual health and growth of the country. Now, Frankfurter's letter did not do this trick. Although what happened was, about a couple of weeks after Frankfurter's letter, the Cosmos Club gets another letter. That letter comes from Woodrow Wilson, who says, my dear sirs, I know I'm writing you to urge the admission of Louis Brandeis to the Cosmos Club. I know, and this is a direct quote, I know Mr. Brandeis and hold him in the highest personal esteem and believe that his admission to the club would not only be an act of justice to him, but would add a member of very fine quality to its list. Sincerely yours, Woodrow Wilson. Not surprisingly, Brandeis was admitted to the Cosmos Club, but getting him confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States was a whole other kettle of fish. Much harder than getting him membership in the Cosmos Club.
Indeed. So you've got Walter Lippmann and Felix Frankfurter rallying to get him confirmed. What did they do to try and move his nomination forward?
Well, one thing they did was they talked to the nominee himself. There were a number of very specific allegations against Brandeis. And let me just sort of be clear. In those days, the nominees did not testify on their own behalf. In fact, Brandeis's law partner, Edward McLennan, represented him before the Senate. But Brandeis was able, through conferences, first with Brandeis and later with Littman, to go through these sort of allegations and sort of so-called disputes, right? I mean, the chief allegation against Brandeis, sort of the umbrella allegation, is that when he was a lawyer, he had acted unethically when he was acting as sort of quote-unquote counsel to the situation, and that his crossing of these ethical lines made him unfit for the Supreme Court, right? So Brandeis acted as sort of counsel to the situation in acting as the lawyer to the estate of his law partner, Samuel Warren, and some of Warren's siblings thought that Brandeis had acted unethically. He had served as counsel to the United Shoe Machinery Company, and then later on, when that company refused to stop engaging in illegal monopolistic practices, advised that company's opponents on a pro bono basis. Again, acting as counsel to the situation, he had succeeded in scuttling the New York-New Haven Railroad merger and alienated all of old Boston. So Frankfurter and Littman sort of wrote about each of these things and the charges against him and what the real story was, with input from Brandeis. But more importantly, they really got to know Brandeis the man. And Brandeis had known, Frankfurter had known Brandeis for several years, but Brandeis was the type of person who really held things close to the vest. But this nomination process, they really, both of them, both Frankfurter and Littman, saw a whole new side to Brandeis. Frankfurter wrote Littman, "The other night I had the most intimate personal talk I ever had with Brandeis." So they not only got enough ammunition to rebut these charges, but they also saw a side of Brandeis they hadn't seen before. The other thing Littman and Frankfurter did was attack Brandeis's attackers. And I think this is where they were most effective. So I discussed A. Lawrence Lowell and the petition by the 51 Boston Brahmins. Well, Walter Lippmann, who was a much less prolix writer than Frankfurter and a much more gifted writer than Frankfurter was, wrote a wonderful editorial and about that the petition was a product of a group psychology. He said it was not an investigation by 51 individual investigations, but one investigation and one verdict, which had been repeated so often that it ceased to require the confirmation of facts. Now, if you could go to and he wrote this in the New Republic. Now, what he wanted to include with that editorial was this chart. And this chart, if you could put up the next slide, it was produced by one of Brandeis's law partners, but it shows all of these people in old Boston with names like Putnam, with names like Weld, right? With names like Lowell, with names, like Adams, right? With names like Coolidge, and all of their interlocking and really insular relationships, whether they were members of the Somerset Club, a trustee or a banker, belonged to a State Street bank, were a Back Bay resident, or were involved or leading a large corporation or corporate activities. Well, this chart was really super damning and really proved Littman's group psychology point. But the owner of the New Republic, Willard Straight, who himself happened to be a J.P. Morgan banker, said, "Not on your life are you putting all these people's names in this chart in the New Republic." So although this chart made it into my book, it never made it into the magazine. The other thing that Littman and Frankfurter did, in addition to attacking the Boston Brahmins, was they went directly after William Howard Taft. And this was really a moment that Frankfurter and Littman had been waiting for a long time, as really members of the House of Truth who hated Taft as President of the United States and were really TR men. Well, they wrote an editorial basically saying, forget about what ex-President Taft has to say about Brandeis because of the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. And he said, they said, this is Walter Lippmann writing in the New Republic, wrote that President Taft had, quote, deceived the public unquote, and then tried to conceal his deception with a falsehood. That's backdating the memo in the Ballinger-Pinchot affair in order to fire Gifford Pinchot. And then they conclude as follows. If Mr. Taft does not like Mr. Brandeis, the human explanation is exceedingly simple, the editorial concluded. It was Mr. Brandeis who demonstrated to the country Mr. Taft's immoral procedure in a disreputable incident. Well, that's kind of a mic drop moment right there, right? Taft was so angry about this New Republic editorial that he considered suing, quote, the socialistic and so-called Uplift magazine for libel. It took his former Attorney General, George Wickersham, to talk him out of suing for libel. And this is what Wickersham said. He said, he described the editors of the magazine as nobody but a bunch of Hebrew uplifters of the same stripe as Brandeis would dream of repeating the criticism about Taft's Ballinger-Pinchot investigation, which I just will add as an aside was really botched by Wickersham himself. So I thought this attack, both on the individual incidences, but also on the motives of Brandeis' attacker, was quite effective. And there was a Senate subcommittee that held hearings on Brandeis' nomination, and they voted 3-2 to send it out of the subcommittee to the full Senate committee. And then nothing happened. And Littman says to Frankfurter, the Senate of the United States, I love this quote, is about 85% dignity, 14% bunkum, and 1% horse sense. This is what Littman writes Frankfurter. If the dignity is left to itself, the horse sense will carry through. Well, the problem is it didn't really carry through. There was a 117-day wait for a committee vote. And Brandeis Frankfurter and Lippmann were getting really nervous.
And even after the committee vote, it just sits for a while.
Correct. So they're panicking. You know, Lippmann and Frankfurter think that the longer this just sits with a committee vote but no floor vote, you know, we're screwed, right? So Frankfurter and Lippmann and a lawyer in Washington who started the firm of Covington and Burling named George Rubley, they had a meeting with Wilson's attorney general, a guy named Thomas Watt Gregory, a terrific attorney general. And Gregory basically told them to calm down, to trust us and take a wait-and-see approach. They told him, don't do anything. Well, on May 5th, Wilson orchestrated an inquiry from the Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Culbertson and replied, like in the Cosmos Club affair, with a long letter praising Brandeis as exceptionally qualified. And it was Wilson's letter that really signaled to Culbertson what the administration's strategy was. And the administration strategy, Wilson and Attorney General Gregory's strategy, was all about Democratic Party loyalty. And they were basically lobbying recalcitrant members of the Senate Judiciary Committee who were Democrats to vote for Brandeis' nomination. They arranged for a meeting in New York between Brandeis and Hoke Smith of Georgia and James Reed of Missouri. They did a favor for the New York Senator James O'Gorman. Woodrow Wilson even goes on a train with Senator Overman of North Carolina and stops in Overman's hometown of Salisbury, North Carolina, and does a whistle stop with Overman to get Overman's vote. And then he has his son-in-law, who happens to be the Treasury Secretary, that's Wilson, William Gibbs McAdoo, lobby John Shields of Tennessee. So basically, by twisting the arms of Democratic senators, on May 24th, the Senate Judiciary Committee vote 117 days after the nomination, votes 10-8 along straight party lines to send Brandeis' name to the full Senate. A week later, Brandeis is confirmed 47-22 with only 3 Republican votes, Robert La Follette and George Norris, 2 notorious progressives, and Miles Poindexter. That's it.
So before we start taking questions from the audience, and you can still type your questions into the chat function on the YouTube channel, let's talk a little bit. Can you talk about the short-term implications of the fight for the Brandeis confirmation?
Yeah, I mean, the short-term implications are the people at the House of Truth, Walter Lippmann, Felix Frankfurter, the people of the New Republic, Herbert Crowley, they finally got one of their own on the court, right? He was sort of the only liberal voice on the court at the time. I think Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. is too hard. Who became Brandeis' ally, but it's too hard to pigeonhole as sort of liberal or conservative. Holmes was really just a skeptic. But they finally had sort of a pro-labor voice on the Supreme Court of the United States, the likes of which they had never had before. The other thing I think it did, in addition, was it really swung liberals to Wilson for his re-election campaign in 1916. He was locked in a tight race against former Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes, and Wilson had actually gone to bed thinking he had lost to Hughes, but narrowly won California and won the election, and no one at the House of Truth voted for Hughes. They all voted for Wilson. Finally, the last sort of short-term implication was really the impact of the Brandeis nomination on the confirmation process in the court itself. This is what the New Republic wrote on June 10th. It wrote, "The Brandeis case is closed. The country has been spared humiliation, and the authority of the court has been immeasurably strengthened. But the editorial warned that future nominees, some of them conservative, might be afforded the same treatment that Brandeis had received." They wrote, this is how the editorial concluded, quote, "Mr. Brandeis' enemies have done more to drag the Supreme Court into politics than the most extreme radical." So I think this idea of Supreme Court nominations being highly politicized as a recent phenomenon is totally incorrect when one looks at Brandeis' nomination. The other thing I just want to point out is sort of this idea of Southern Democrats really rallying to Brandeis and saving his nomination. And that even though Brandeis was a great social reformer, that Brandeis himself was from Louisville and could be considered a Southern Democrat, right? And sort of was very deferential to states' rights. That didn't make him any less of a social reformer, but he sort of picked his spots.
So, long-term implications beyond the politicization of nominations? What would you say add to that?
I think the long-term implications is Brandeis is really this voice for civil liberties, right? And what I mean by that is Brandeis wrote the famous dissent in Olmstead versus United States about the right to privacy, right? And he also concurred in Whitney versus California and sort of makes a stirring defense of free speech and linking it as essential to our democracy. And I think there's really an overlooked opinion of his that I really just want to raise and bring up because I find it endlessly fascinating. One criticism of Brandeis was he was not great on race, that he was really silent on most racial questions. He had joined the Supreme Court's unanimous opinion in Gonglum versus Rice, upholding racially segregated schools in 1927. But in 1924, Brandeis writes a majority opinion in Wan versus the United States. Zhang Sung Wan was a Chinese national and student who was accused of a triple murder. He was at that house where the murder occurred earlier in the day. D.C. police arrested him and held him incommunicado for 9 days in a hotel. And Wan at the time was suffering from the Spanish flu, and the police were denying him access to food, water, and sleep. So they interrogated him for 9 straight days, and finally, to end this nightmare, Wan confessed. So he could recover from his illness and get some food and water and sleep. As soon as he recovered, he recanted. This is in a fabulous book by Scott Seligman called The Third Degree, by the way. Well, Brandeis writes this amazing opinion for the majority of the court, reversing Wan's conviction as a product of a coerced confession. And the reason why that's significant is because the Juan case, although Brandeis never wrote an opinion in favor of African Americans, the Juan case really led to a long line of coerced confession decisions by the Supreme Court protecting the rights of African Americans, particularly in the South. And the cases I'm thinking about is Brown versus Mississippi in 1936, which was written by Chief Justice Hughes, and Chambers versus Florida, which is about the famous case that's written about in the book Devil in the Grove, where Hugo Black reverses a coerced confession. So this Juan case was really the foundational precedent for this idea that the Supreme Court can intervene when the police really use the third degree and other sort of brutal tactics to extract confessions, many of which are false. And I really think Brandeis doesn't get enough credit for this. He often gets credit for Olmsted. He often gets credit for Whitney, but he really doesn't get credit for the Juan case. And it's a great D.C. case. It's a case that interferes with the power of the federal government because the D.C., but not the states, right? So, this is a really important case. And it really shows that Brandeis is a social reformer, not just on labor issues, not just as it relates to states' rights, but also on criminal justice issues.
Before we take questions from the audience, what conclusions can be drawn about the Brandeis nomination fight?
Well, I think some of the conclusions that could be drawn are that great justices are worth fighting for, right? When somebody is indisputably the best lawyer of his generation, as Louis Brandeis was, he was worth taking up the fight for, right? He was worth the crusade that Frankfurter and Lippmann went on. He was worth the arms that Woodrow Wilson twisted in the Senate to get him confirmed. He was worth attacking President Lowell in Old Boston, and he was worth attacking ex-President Taft, right? I think that's one. I think the second thing is that they're partisan affairs, right? That these things tend to be viewed through the view of a partisan lens. And even though at the time of Brandeis' nomination, there were liberal and conservative wings of the Democratic Party, and there were liberal and conservative wings of the Republican Party, it was a completely partisan affair. And, if not for Democratic Party loyalty, Louis Brandeis does not get on the Supreme Court of the United States.
Thank you. So an audience member would like to hear about any fallout in Boston after the confirmation.
It's funny. I think the person who took the brunt of the fallout was Frankfurter, right? Because at this point in time in 1916, Frankfurter goes from living in the House of Truth during the 1912 election to teaching at Harvard Law School. And sort of Frankfurter replaces Brandeis as public enemy number one, right? And really, Frankfurter's enemy and antagonist during his time at Harvard Law School is A. Lawrence Lowell. So he basically made a permanent foe of the president of Harvard, and that really came back to haunt Felix Frankfurter in a number of different situations, the most prominent of which was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, the two Italian anarchists, whom Frankfurter was fighting for a new trial for in 1927, the problem being that A. Lawrence Lowell happened to be the chair of the committee reviewing that conviction for the governor for clemency purposes and for new trial purposes. And also on other episodes, like when Lowell tried to institute a 15% quota on Jewish students at Harvard, he left Frankfurter off the committee of professors to review that proposal. And it took Frankfurter really was the outcast that Brandeis was. And Brandeis never received any of that fallout because he moved to Washington.
So was the judicial language code for something else? Was it anti-Semitism?
So I think it was both, right? It's funny, there are letters from Frankfurter to a Jewish federal judge named Julian Mack, who was one of the first Jewish federal judges and a friend of Brandeis's and a friend of Frankfurter's. And Brandeis described the anti-Semitism as a make-weight, right? He said, it's a make-weight, that's all. Frankfurter really saw the opposition based on Brandeis's stands in Boston, right? His reform on public utilities, his opposition to mergers that hurt big business. They weren't quick to see anti-Semitism. But for me, looking back at it, it seems to me anti-Semitism was a huge piece of it. And it was a huge piece of President Lowell's opposition. And sadly, I think it was part of Taft's, some of the language that President Taft used in private seemed pretty anti-Semitic as well. So I think it was both ideological and anti-Semitism.
Thank you. We have a question from Philip Strom. What do you see as the relationship between Louis Brandeis and the Denisons of the House of Truth while he was on the court?
Oh, well, that's pretty interesting. Well, with regard to Frankfurter, they had a really interesting relationship that's often been called sort of half-brother, half-son. And while Brandeis was on the court, Frankfurter took over litigation that Brandeis had started for the National Consumers League. This is around 1916. So almost as soon as Brandeis is nominated for the court, Frankfurter takes on the role of defending minimum wage laws and maximum hour laws, the constitutionality of which are really called into question by the famous 1905 case Lochner versus New York, in which the Supreme Court struck down a New York maximum hour law for bakers. Frankfurter and Brandeis are really trying to defend those laws, and Frankfurter takes over that defense. Not only does he take over those causes that Brandeis had championed, but he's also receiving money from Brandeis for his pro bono work. So Brandeis, who became a multimillionaire as a lawyer in Boston, representing sort of small and mid-sized businesses, he started basically out of his own pocket while he was on the court, giving Frankfurter money somewhere between $2,000 to $3,000 a year for his pro bono work. So Frankfurter was really carrying it on all through the late teens and the early 20s. And Frankfurter and Julian Mack, once Brandeis joins the court, take a much more public role in Zionist activity. So Brandeis enlisted both Frankfurter and Mack as Zionists and to become involved in the American Zionist movement. And once Brandeis goes on the court, Brandeis has to play an even more behind-the-scenes role, and that forces Frankfurter and others to take a more public role on behalf and in lobbying for a Jewish state at places like the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Great question. Professor Strum, I just want to say it's so great to have you on this call, and her book is terrific. Everybody should read it.
Absolutely. Maybe one last question from the audience. From Judith Cherlin, can you say something about the relationship between Justice Brandeis and Chief Justice Taft when they were on the court together? Yeah,
this is another sort of really interesting things about how people, it's a great question. Their relationship was really excellent, right, in a lot of ways. Just sort of on an interpersonal basis, they were not at odds. Taft, later on and becomes Chief Justice when the Chief Justice that he had appointed, Edward Douglas White, died. And then Taft becomes chief, and Taft really finds his calling as Chief Justice and is a great administrator on the court and is really good in sort of managing the Supreme Court as an institution. He and Brandeis have a good relationship. They respect each other, but Taft came to resent Brandeis, and at one point he said that Brandeis had 2 votes instead of 1. And by that, he thought that Brandeis had not only his own vote, but Holmes's vote too. Because one of the things that Brandeis was very successful at doing while he was on the court was really opening Holmes's eyes to some of these social justice and civil liberties issues, and he sort of encouraged Holmes to write dissents in which he wouldn't have otherwise dissented. And in Myers v. U.S., which was a presidential power case where Taft wrote the majority opinion and Brandeis wrote a famous dissent about the president's power to remove administrative officials, that's when Taft really got annoyed when Holmes sided with Brandeis on that and accused Brandeis of having 2 votes instead of 1. But their relationship was good. I think Taft really gained a respect for Brandeis's legal acumen once they sat on the court together. It's really funny how people can be political opponents and then they join this really small institution, Jennifer, as you know how small it is, right? You work there, and then these 9 personalities form relationships with each other, and there's sometimes strange bedfellows among the justices. And I think that was true then, and I think it's true now.
I think it's always the case. So thank you, Brad. This was terrific. We could go on for another hour, but Zoom will kick us off shortly. It's now my pleasure to introduce Kara Blond. As Executive Director of the Capital Jewish Museum, Kara Blond is leading the planning, design, and construction of a new Jewish museum in the nation's capital in downtown Washington, D.C. Kara has spent the previous 10 years at the Smithsonian Institution. Please welcome Kara Blond.
Thank you so much, Brad and Jennifer. That was a fascinating conversation. I learned so much, and just the number of things that are relevant to the conversations that we're having today is really remarkable. I also wanted to join Brad in recognizing Justice Brandeis's grandsons, Frank Gilbert, who is a really honored past president of our organization, and Walter Rauschenbusch and their families who've joined us today. It's really meaningful that you're participating. And I also just wanted to take a moment as we're concluding to thank everybody for joining us on behalf of the Capital Jewish Museum. As Jennifer said, we are in this adventure, a process of building a new Jewish museum in downtown Washington, and conversations like the one that we had today are really at the heart of our plans. We want to explore stories that sit at this really interesting intersection of American democracy and American Judaism right here in the heart of our nation's capital. For us, the goal is really to put the past squarely in the context of issues that are being discussed today, that are in the news, that are on at our dinner tables. And we want to ask our visitors to make grappling with the past a basis for planning for the future. So we are thrilled to create this new civic space for storytelling and conversation and debate in our city. We're actually just starting museum construction this month for all of our new exhibition galleries and programming spaces. And as part of this project, we're restoring the first synagogue that was built in Washington, D.C. in 1876. And that will actually be the centerpiece of the new museum. So I'm excited to invite all of you to join us when we open our doors in about a year and a half in 2022. And in the meantime, I hope that you'll join us for some of our ongoing programming, including one on December 2nd at 7 p.m. We'll have a conversation with C-SPAN's communications director and author of When Rabbis Bless Congress, Howard Mortman. It should be a really interesting evening, so I hope you can join us for that. You can register and learn more about our plans at capitaljewishmuseum.org. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, and please, everybody, stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.